We're pleased to be joined by Janet Napolitano, who's the current president of the University of California, former Secretary of Homeland Security, former governor of Arizona, former Attorney General of Arizona, and the author of this book, How Safe Are We? Homeland Security Since 9/11. Secretary Napolitano, what's the semi-short answer to the question you ask on the cover of your book?
Well, the semi-short answer is that in some areas we are indeed safer. It is difficult to imagine, for example, that today we could experience the same type of attack that we did on 9/11. But there are new emerging and evolving threats that really should occupy our attention, and I would name three. One is the security threats that emanate from global warming. One is cybersecurity, and one is the threat of mass gun violence.
Why do you say that we're safer from the threats that emanated on 9/11 today than we were
So
then?
when you go back and reverse engineer what happened on 9/11, you had foreign nationals who came to the United States, attended flight school, were able to get on airplanes, take over the cockpit, take over the flight of those planes, fly them into iconic buildings. Well, now, for example, we have required that the cockpit door be shut so that passengers cannot even get in there. So that's just one kind of practical thing that occurred after 9/11 that would prevent it from happening again.
Does the Department of Homeland Security work? 250,000 or so employees, myriad departments. Is it an effective organization?
It is effective. It is still evolving. It's still a young department by federal government age perspectives. It was comprised of 22 separate agencies that were all put under one umbrella. They came from different legacy departments, from Treasury, from Transportation, from Justice, to name but three. You know, all put under one umbrella. So it takes a while to blend and mold that into kind of a unity of effort, kind of mission-driven organization, but it's getting there.
Is the border a danger zone? You did not mention that as one of your three areas.
No, the border is an area that needs to be managed. It's an area where thousands of trucks and vehicles transit every day, thousands of people transit every day. Mexico is our number 2 or 3 trading partner. And so what you need to have at the border are effective precautions at the ports of entry. And then you need to secure the vast area between those ports. And to do that, you need manpower, you need technology, sensors, tunnel detection equipment, things of that sort. Air cover, drones, etc., along the border. But if you put together a strategy there, you can manage that border zone. And, you know, under President Obama, we drove illegal immigration to 40-year lows by deploying such a strategy.
Fence doesn't work? Wall doesn't work?
You know, fencing in some areas works. So when I was secretary, we were working under something called the Secure Fence Act, which had the experts on the ground had identified 700 miles of that 1,940-mile border where having some kind of physical infrastructure would have a positive impact. We completed 654 miles of that. They need to complete the rest. But the idea of building a wall across 1,940 miles is enormously expensive, impractical, and really won't work to stop the kind of migration we're seeing now.
Janet Napolitano is our guest. We're going to put the phone numbers up on the screen. You can dial in. 202 is the area code, 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. From your book, I want to read a quote. The question of a trade-off, 100% privacy or 100% security, is outdated if it ever was the case. The more relevant question is how the privacy analysis is integrated into any security program so that it is taken into account from the outset, a concept known as privacy by design. We've lost a lot of our privacy over the last 20 years. Is that, or 19 years? Is that a fair statement?
Well, we have surrendered it mostly to the private sector, through our subscriptions on Facebook, Amazon, etc. But from a government perspective, we still need to get out of that false dichotomy that if you're doing something on security, you must, by definition, sacrifice privacy. If you're doing something for privacy, you must, by definition, sacrifice security. They can be integrated concepts.
Did you know or consult with Kirstjen Nielsen at all when she was secretary?
No, I've never had a chance to speak with her.
Janet Napolitano is our guest, and we are talking about border security, cybersecurity, and how safe are we? That is the name of her book. When you came into office at DHS, how much of your time was spent on cybersecurity?
About 10%, but by the time I left, it was a good 40%. It is an enormously complicated subject, rapidly growing. We actually did not conceive that our actual election system would be attacked by a foreign adversary, as it was in 2016. I think an open question is what we're really doing to prevent that from happening in 2020.
When you say our election system was attacked, was the actual election system attacked in your view, or it was influenced via private companies?
So I think there's an open question as to whether the actual election systems were attacked. But certainly what we saw was the ability for them to be infiltrated, and we saw enormous infiltration of social media, the hacking of the Clinton campaign, the planting of false and misleading stories on Facebook, on Twitter, etc., all of which had an influence on the election, all to the benefit of now President Trump and at the disadvantage of Hillary Clinton.
What's your take on Julian Assange?
I hope he gets prosecuted. I think he participated in a hack. I don't think what he did can properly be called journalism, and so I hope he gets extradited and prosecuted.
Back to how safe are we? As a country, we are not prepared for the cyber equivalent of 9/11, and it's time to close that gap.
Yeah, so what I think we should be concerned about is a massive denial of service attack where, utilities are shut down, the traffic system is disabled, the 9/11 system is cut off. All of these are network systems, and we really have not strengthened our cybersecurity to prevent that, nor do we have good recovery and resilience protocols in place. Like, how do you recover? Who do you call, if you can call, because telecommunications could be shut down. One of the thoughts I had, and I talk about in the book, is the creation of a cyber FEMA. FEMA works with local communities on preparation for and response to natural disasters of all types. I think we have enough red flags to foresee a cyber disaster, and we should be getting ready.
Well, let's hear from some of our callers. Let's begin with Carl in Madison, Wisconsin. You're on with former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano.
Good evening, Janice. How you doing? This
Good.
is when I was in the first Gulf War during George Bush Sr., and I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And I was very disappointed in 9/11, and I see President Trump trying to build a relationship with the Saudis. But when I was over there, I got along with a lot of people. I was in the food service operation, and I was downtown where the soldiers, for Christmas and Thanksgiving, I had to go down there and bake. That's where the king and the prince got their food from. But I worked around a lot of foreign people. But I was very disappointed in 9/11 because I thought the U.S. did a lot to help the Saudis, but I was very disappointed. But
all right, Carl, thank you for calling in. Pardon me. Is it fair to blame a nation like Saudi Arabia for 9/11? Is there evidence that there was official support?
No. It is true that the majority of the attackers were Saudis, but there's no evidence that the country of Saudi Arabia supported or enabled the attacks. This was an Al-Qaeda directed effort.
Let's hear from Arthur, who is calling from Port Arthur, Texas. Hi, Arthur.
Hello there. Good afternoon here, Texas time. Mr. Napolitano, thank you so much for your service to the country. And in that vein, as you talked about the impracticalness of the southern border wall, what is your estimate of how much it will cost to dismantle that when the country comes to the reality that it was a waste of time and money? And then what are your thoughts about the security on the northern border? And thank you so much for your time and information.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. So I don't have an estimate of how much it would cost to dismantle a wall. I do think it's highly unlikely that during the Trump presidency you could actually complete construction of the wall. But in the meantime, if he pursues his current path, you're going to have millions, if not billions of dollars misspent on something that's a symbol and not a strategy. And in terms of the northern border, we rarely talk about the northern border. It's actually longer than our southwest border. It's much more sparsely populated. There are a few ports of entry along that northern border through which a lot of trade occurs with Canada. So the ports near Detroit, for example, which support the automotive industry. So we have the same issues there with making sure that those ports are technology enabled and properly staffed so that the legitimate traffic and trade can go through there. And then we need to be thinking about using technology across the hundreds and hundreds of miles where virtually no people live on either side of the border, but to make sure that we are able to detect illegal crossings that might be occurring there.
Is there a racial aspect to, in your view, to the fact that the Canadian border is much less protected?
You know, I don't want to go there. I think that it's a much less traffic border where illegal migration is concerned. So I think that is one of the reasons there's so much attention being paid to the southwest border.
Next call for Janet Napolitano comes from Dick in Marion, Illinois. Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your service, Dr. Napolitano. My question is, why is it that we're approaching the problem from the outside in rather than from the inside out? Walls have a way of playing both ways, and that is really, to me, a real kind of irrelevant question. I think we need a national identification system that is functional. We could use the green card and use that and attach it for anybody coming into this country, whether legal or illegal, doesn't make any difference. We could work out the amnesty issue with regard to the cities and also be able to basically require that any employer or any person that is registering students or otherwise, that they have this green card available. All costs would be basically referred to the federal level for reimbursement for any element of personal service. It would also give us a means to census-wise track people. I know when I was in Germany stationed in NATO, at the end of my tour of duty, I was bumming around Europe. I dressed like a German and acted like a German. And when I was on a train talking with a German conductor, he asked me for my pass, and he said, "Let me see your ticket." I produced a Eurail pass. He told me I was not to have that. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "These are only eligible for Americans." He said, "Let me see your passport." I had to pull my passport and identify that I was an American citizen. we could use the green card in the same way. We have the metrics for
All right,
facial.
Dick, I think we got the point. A national identification card was the first thing he raised.
So a national ID, there's some real resistance to that in the United States. It actually goes to that concept of privacy and personal liberty that we have. In the sense of IDs for immigrants, we actually have a lot of what the caller is suggesting. And we have a system called E-Verify for employers where they can check through the Social Security system whether an employee is here legally or not. And one of the things we did when I was at DHS was rather than do these great big workplace raids, we would go in and audit employers to see if they're called I-9s. If their I-9 paperwork was in order, the I-9 establishes the legal presence of an employee in the United States. And that was a way to kind of incentivize and encourage employers that they need to abide by the immigration system because, as we know, it is that huge demand for undocumented labor that is a major draw to the United States.
So what about his second point, which was amnesty? Is it time? Ronald Reagan did it in the 80s?
86, yeah.
86. Is it time for a round of amnesty in your view?
I think it's time for a round of earned citizenship, which I do not view as amnesty. What I think of is if people have been in the country for a certain period of time, if they have a clean criminal record, if they've been paying taxes, if they have been otherwise contributing to the community, then I think they ought to be able to apply for legal presence and then move from legal presence to actual citizenship.
When you were DHS Secretary, and even today, what is it that keeps you awake at night? What is that threat that you just can't get your hands around?
You know, I'm a pretty good sleeper, which I think you have to be when you're the Secretary of Homeland Security. But when I would play in my head, you know, kind of what-if scenarios, the what-if scenarios were things like, what if we didn't have one landfall hurricane, but 3 or 4? What if we didn't have just one mass gun event and one community, but a half a dozen of them all at the same time? What if we had a true cyber attack on a community that shut everything down? Those were the what-if scenarios that I worried about.
Lynn, Detroit, good morning.
Good morning. So one of the nice things about living in Detroit is I get to listen to all the Canadian news. And you were talking about the unsecured Canadian border. Listening to the Canadian news, yeah, that's a problem for them too because of the illegal immigration going north, especially in the wintertime up there on all those very few areas where there's people living. But the original question I called for was you had talked about the wall and that it was probably going to be insufficient for what we're facing nowadays. So I was wondering what suggestions she had that would be better, helpful for the security in the southern border.
Yeah. So,
thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. So I think what we ought to do is I think about it as flood the zone with the rule of law. Move every immigration judge we have down to the border. Recruit other administrative law judges from other departments in a kind of all of government, unity of effort, also to deploy to the southwest border. Put the cases of those who are arriving now first in line to be adjudicated as to whether they've established a credible fear of persecution, allowing them to remain in the country while their claim of asylum is fully explored. But I think this is, first of all, it should not have been an unanticipated issue. The traffic just doesn't magically appear at the border. It's been developing over a period of time. So I wonder what the government was actually doing to prepare. But beyond that, now I think we need an all-of-government effort so that people who come can make their asylum claims. Those can be adjudicated fairly and expeditiously, and then move on from there. So that's, if I were advising the president, that's what I would advise him to do.
Did you ever talk to your counterparts in Honduras and Guatemala, Mexico, et cetera, and say, have you thought about different policies so that people don't want to leave your country?
Oh, absolutely. We worked very closely with Mexico to strengthen their own efforts at their southern border to get a better handle on illegal migration transiting Mexico. And we worked with Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador on things like gang violence reduction, on strengthening civil institutions. We did that through something called the Merida Initiative, where Congress actually appropriated millions of dollars to deploy to those countries. And we were actually, until recently, seeing a reduction in the homicide rate in Guatemala, by way of example. We ought to look at that area similarly to how we handled Colombia. So Colombia a few years ago was a narco state, and we started something called Plan Colombia, where we put in dedicated U.S. resources working with Colombians who didn't want to live in a narco state. And now it's no longer a narco state. It's a tourist destination. It's going to take, and it took several years to get there. It doesn't just happen overnight. But it needs to be, we need to have that same kind of persistent effort and investment over time to really deal with the source of this illegal migration.
From How Safe Are We, there is no greater contradiction between our expectations and our actions than on the topic of immigration and border security. No one questions that our country, and every country for that matter, is entitled to enforce its borders and determine who can be a legal resident or become a citizen. We all agree that the U.S. immigration system is broken. The question is how to fix it. Currently 11 million undocumented people living in the U.S. Harry is in Brush Prairie, Washington. Go ahead, Harry.
Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Napolitano mentioned that global climate change was the first thing she mentioned. Well, how does crippling America by climate laws and taxing us and raising the price of all of our things? Washington State here tried to pass a law, and thank goodness our citizens voted it down, which would have driven all of our prices of all of our fuels and everything way out of sight. And how does that solve? How can we even prove there's any global climate change created by us? Our climate changes constantly, whether we're here or not, and no matter what we do. I think that climate change is an actual farce, man-made climate change. I watch a lot of nature shows, and I've had even kids that believe in this, and they'll say, well, the oceans are, ice caps melting. And I said, I went down to the coast clam digging a few weeks ago, and it was the same ocean I saw when I was a kid. So I'm having a really hard time believing all this hope.
All right, Harry, thank you for your call. Janet Napolitano.
So I actually think the fact of global warming is a known scientific fact, and it's been measured any number of ways. And I can appreciate the caller saying, well, I went down clam digging and I saw the same ocean. But that doesn't mean that the oceans are not themselves gradually rising. If you live in Miami, Florida, for example, you know that that is the case. And so I think the United States needs to join the community of nations and do our part to reduce the rate by which the planet is warming. We should rejoin the Paris Accords. And we're the only nation in the world, except I think Syria, that's not a signatory on the Paris Accords. But beyond that, we need to focus on adaptation to the climate change that already has occurred. How do we build our roads? Where do we put our bridges? How do we, and whether we rebuild communities that are destroyed by these extreme weather events that happen on an increasing frequency. What kinds of materials do we use in those communities? So there's a lot that we can do as a country to make ourselves safer from the climate change that already has occurred.
Who is Karen Breslau, your co-author?
Karen Breslau is a journalist. She has covered international relations for a number of publications, and was a wonderful co-author.
How's the health of the University of California?
University of California is doing great. It is the best public research university on the planet. 10 campuses, world-leading research, great students, great faculty.
If you are a resident of California, can you still get a free education? Wasn't that the case in one day?
It was, but many, many days ago. But we've held in-state tuition flat for 7 of the last 8 years. It went up by 2.5% 1 year in that period. It's going to be flat again next year. And over half of our California students actually pay no tuition because they come from families that make less than $80,000 a year.
And finally, a relatively inconsequential question, but one that we've debated. Is your last name pronounced Napolitano or Napolitano?
Napolitano.
Tano, the hard tan. Okay, thank you for that. Here is the book, How Safe Are We? Homeland Security Since 9/11, University of California President, former DHS Secretary, former Governor of Arizona, Janet Napolitano is the author. Thank you for your time here at the LA Book Fair.
Thank you for having me.